With the term anorexia, we usually think of an eating disorder, but in today's video, I want to explore emotional anorexia. When we think of anorexia in terms of the eating disorder, we think of a restriction. It's a restriction of food intake and then an expulsion of food in terms of purging. And there's many forms of eating disorders and some of them sort of crisscross, but when we look at the control that's involved with something like an eating disorder, anorexia, it's usually related to something we can't control externally, perhaps chaos in the family growing up. So we're going to control the one thing we can control, which is our intake of food. So in a similar way, emotional anorexia is basically a coping mechanism, a defense mechanism usually set up in childhood where a child is finding a way to, in some way, cope with all the emotional trauma around them. Well, one good way to defend against it is not to let it in or let it out. Usually the child decides along the way that it's just simply easier to shut myself down emotionally rather than risk feeling anything that's coming my way. That's just way too painful, and the child has probably learned that the hard way. An example of this, let's say, is perhaps a 10-year-old boy who is being raised by an alcoholic father. The father finally bolts, leaves the family, abandons the child, but calls the boy's mother every so often and says, "I'll be there this Saturday to pick him up." Every Saturday, perhaps for months, the boy's sitting on the porch waiting for his alcoholic father to show up and swoop him up for some fantastic weekend. So there's a strong fantasy going on here. Let's say the father never shows up. The 10-year-old boy realizes, I can't control any of this. I have no control over anything. I had no control about my parents fighting. I had no control over my dad leaving. I have no control about him being a drunk. And I have no control over him coming here to pick me up on Saturday mornings. So finally he gives up. I'm not feeling anything. I'm not going here anymore. He has no control over any of this, but he does have control over one thing: his emotions. And now he's going to take that and run with it. And by God, he's going to control his emotions. And that includes being an emotional anorexic. So just like with bulimia, another eating disorder, it's the vomiting, the throwing up of the food, it's the expelling of it. And so with emotional anorexia, it's the expelling of any vulnerable, loving emotions. Maybe somebody's getting too close. I don't want that. I got to get rid of it. I got to expel it. My father who wants back in after he abandoned the family, I'm not going to do that. And if somehow he reaches me a little bit, I'm going to throw it up. Symbolically, just like the bulimic, I'm going to expel it. This starts the formation of emotional anorexia. So if you don't have to take in somebody's love, then you're not going to have to expel it. So then the anorexia gets more firm because nothing's coming in here. Nothing's breaking this boundary. And a word that really applies here for people who may not quite get this concept right now is the fear is that if they take in love, if I let my boundaries down, I'm going to be annihilated, erased, X'd out. Now think of how terrifying that is to somebody. If a kid's growing up a victim of some sort of childhood trauma, then it's too risky to risk love. You may be annihilated. Who wants to be annihilated? Think of that word. The word itself is frightening. So people do many things consciously or unconsciously to avoid being X'd out. Many traumas can cause this, and there can be many features it's associated with, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, various anxiety disorders. But one that's there usually for sure is some fear of abandonment. If it's done more unconsciously, sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, but if it's more unconsciously driven, the person doing it will find ways to sabotage any sort of closeness. So they may wonder, what's going on? Why don't I have many close friends? Why can't I seem to date and hang on to a boyfriend or a girlfriend? Like, what's up with that? They're not aware of it consciously, but unconsciously they're finding ways to make sure it doesn't happen by sabotaging it. But just like with the eating disorder of anorexia, most victims of this, just like Karen Carpenter, can be very friendly. They want to help, they want to be nice, but slowly, little by little, there's resentment building up over the years. There's a bitterness there. And they may explode from time to time on somebody, but then they feel so guilty about it because they're letting themselves show emotion and they're letting themselves be seen by other people. People may think I care. I don't want them to think I care. So now when they're guilt, they're more determined than ever to just block off all feelings and remain very neutral about everything. They go back to the people-pleasing mode as a way to survive, a coping mechanism, and then the cycle continues. And if somebody in this situation gets older and they're determined to have a relationship, they realize, no, I do want to get married someday. I want to settle down. Because they're so walled off and it's hard for them to connect with others in an intimate, authentic way, they begin to think perhaps that any relationship, a bad relationship, is better than no relationship. And of course, now they're digging themselves in even deeper because that's not going to work, that type of thinking. A relationship like that is rarely going to work. And if it does so-called work, there's nothing really authentic or real or happy about it. So one way to avoid all of this is to be aware of what's going on with you. Be aware if you're setting up walls and boundaries, if you feel like an emotional anorexic, because there's plenty of help out there. In therapy, a therapist can help you look at the underlying reasons that started in childhood that contributed for you to begin putting up a cement wall around yourself. And in removing that wall is how we begin to find healing and inner peace and some joy and real authentic connection with somebody else. If you're interested, I did do a video about Karen Carpenter and her eating disorder. I'll have the link in the description box below. There's many similarities to the eating disorder, anorexia, and to the emotional form of it as well. Please leave me some comments below. Let me know if you have any questions about this. It's a very interesting topic. It's very workable. If somebody's committed to understanding themselves and feeling their feelings, this can be worked through. Please subscribe to my mental health YouTube channel if you like these kind of videos. And until next week, this is Brad Shore signing out from Ask a Friend.